What's going on? Welcome to Asian Cosell. So before we get started, if you can give me the HKO special, help the king out, hit the like, subscribe, and comment. So today we're gonna dive real deep into the Korean series here. So yeah, and shout out to the Happy Project. So you got Cedric and Becky, but I think this is a put in by Becky, and she interviews one of the guys. I forgot his name, but his name will be mentioned in here. So we're gonna break this video down. So let's get to it. So here we go.
June 27th, the United States officially entered the Korean War.
I've covered a couple of wars since then and found a lot of stories from a lot of different places.
The aftermath was devastating. One consequence of the war and how it was handled is something we still see today. The war orphans. The US was able to solve this problem by benevolently adopting the abandoned and parentless Korean children, embracing them in a nation that was far more diverse and far more accepting than the Korea of that time. If the US had not stepped in to adopt, those children would have never, ever had a chance. Is this the entire unfiltered truth?
Okay, so we're gonna dig really deep into this. So yep, so we're gonna find out. So let's get into it.
Yet, no one who was there, soldier or reporter, is likely to forget it.
We talked with historian Yuri Dulin, and this interview turned that narrative upside down.
My work looks at lasting legacies and human consequences of U.S. militarism in Asia and the Pacific. So I've written a lot about, for instance, like Korean military brides, U.S. military camp towns, mixed race Koreans, and Korean adoption. The current book project I'm working on is a...
Okay, so again, here's Yuli Doolin. So here he's gonna talk about the first Asian. So here we go.
history of mixed race Koreans born before, during, and in the immediate aftermath years of the Korean War to US soldiers and Korean women, and kind of what happened to these children. The spoiler alert is they became kind of this targeted demographic to start international adoption in South Korea. This was because the GI fathers were not able to bring those mixed race children back to the United States at the time, given kind of anti-Asian sentiment in military policy and also immigration law. And so mixed race Korean children were oftentimes left behind in South Korea with their Korean mothers. At a certain point during the post-war recovery of Korea, humanitarians, missionaries, philanthropists were looking at this as a huge kind of like PR crisis for the US at a time where the US was trying to win over the allegiances of the third world and kind of the Cold War standoff against the Soviet Union. So that's kind of the story that the book tells, like how it was that, you know, these children came into existence, what it was that happened to them, how they were kind of prized from their South Korean homes and environments and placed into US families stateside, and where they are today.
So you had mentioned the camp towns.
Yes.
And these are sort of like the shanty entertainment venues that popped up were around wherever the military bases were here in Korea. And that's where a lot of Korean women would end up working, not always as prostitutes, right?
Oftentimes during that era, we're talking about like the 1940s, 1950s, if there was the presence of a mixed race child, it oftentimes was not kind of the result of reckless personnel behavior. It was the result of a longer term companionship between a US soldier and a Korean woman. Because the US military had a policy at the time of not allowing their soldiers to marry Korean women. And this was due to kind of a widespread stereotyping that Korean women did not make suitable marriageable partners to American men. They were all prostitutes. It was kind of a really difficult path to the United States. And so many times after a soldier's tour of duty, they would promise to come back for their wives and children. They would promise to figure it out, but they couldn't. So they were just kind of, you know, shipped back to the US or wherever they were supposed to go. And they would like lose contact with their families in that way. That first generation of mixed race Koreans who were later adopted into US families, many of them actually, you know, they had families that had hoped to be intact biological families, but they were forced apart by other circumstances of it.
Yeah. Okay, and just one thing I want to bring is like mostly the immigration of Koreans to the United States. It didn't occur till like maybe in the late 60s and the 70s. So that was as he said, the sentiment back in the 53s and the 55s, you know, there was that, maybe that little sentiment. So maybe 15 years later, because that's, when I was born here in the United States when my parents came after the 70s. So let's continue.
It's interesting you make this parallel between what was happening in Japan with the U.S. military bases there.
So
봄 미쳤다. 브루스 페이스 워시 비비지 말고 간편하게 강력한 초.
The Korean War is ongoing, right? It wasn't just the 3 years that we typically identify as being. It ended in an armistice agreement, not a formal peace treaty. That kept Korea designated in the minds of the U.S. military as a hardship tour, whereas occupied Japan, that was not a formal war zone, right? It was a place where the U.S. hoped to build a bulwark of U.S. democracy in East Asia. So the bases really were set up to be kind of like permanent suburbs, permanent American suburbs.
A lot more suitable for families.
A lot more suitable for a family culture. So there's a more family-oriented culture in occupied Japan versus a bachelor society in U.S.-occupied Korea that really contributes, I think, to the way then that Asian women in these two occupation zones are seen.
It is terribly ironic that the U.S. military then did not deem Korean women as proper to be as wives, and yet did not also, they somewhat encouraged like the fraternization in terms of as prostitutes. So you have mentioned that transracial, transnational adoption, kind of at the heart of that are mixed Koreans.
Yeah, so you had this population of mixed race children who were separated from their GI fathers. And you had a lot of, communist rivals pointing to these children as evidence of like US imperialism, irresponsibility, and immorality in the third world, right? The US wasn't operating as an empire in Korea. So they were a huge source of criticism on part of the international community.
And this is at the time post the Korean War, Cold War era.
Context,
so the US is trying to prove themselves as a worthy leader of the new democratic world.
Yep,
right?
exactly, precisely. These children become very visible. And not only are they visible, they're figures that elicit a lot of emotional response from Americans, who then feel very compelled to participate in kind of the post-war recovery by taking care of their humanitarian welfare and or through adopting them.
Okay, so in a way, you kind of see where, the international adopting came, and besides the U.S., right, other countries started to come into the mix to start doing this too. So let's go.
So you have these missionaries who set up kind of these pipelines for adoption, and they really focus initially on rescuing, in air quotes, rescuing the mixed race Korean children. Also, we're talking about a time where international adoption is just forming, and so there aren't necessarily like safeguards in place to protect the children from, various kinds of hostilities they might experience in the U.S., including the vetting of adopted parents.
Right. It seems almost like the emotion of we want to rescue these children and give them a better home kind of was bigger than actually systemically getting things in place so that it would be safe and healthy.
Absolutely. Americans definitely operated as saviors primarily, and like social welfare workers or people concerned about, the social welfare of these children as a secondary thought. It did cause a lot of bad placements, and also just, like Korean mothers lost their children. It's evident if you look at the oral histories or memoir of numerous Camptown women who had mixed-race children and sent them for adoption, that they were coerced to do so. They were given monetary bribes or incentives, or children were literally forcibly prized from them. So there's just a lot of abuse that happened in those early adoptions. And part of the reason why it was possible was because this kind of like frenzied distortion that Americans had to do this, that otherwise these children were going to die in Korea.
Yes.
Right? Which I kind of challenged in the book. What I found in like more oral history interviews was a lot of these mixed race Korean adoptees had really fond memories of their early lives in Korea. And they had living, loving birth mothers and even loving extended family. And actually, because at the time, Korea was in post-war poverty, the camp towns were economic centers. And as women working in close proximity to US base, the mothers of these mixed race children actually were quite privileged relative to the generally war-torn population. So materially, and this is an observation even like noted in like social welfare reports of that time, they're noting, oh, these children are even better off than those in the average Korean family. So that really doesn't line up with the narrative that we've been taught to believe that, you know, it was impossible.
So so I was kind of thinking about all these things of, you know, what 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 is real, and what yeah the you know yeah, as he said, the narrative about it. So you know, how did they survive? You know, so yeah. All right, so let's keep going.
Possible for these children to have a future in South Korea and that they had to go to the United States. That's certainly not to undermine the lived experiences of Koreans who faced incredible hardship and hatred in South Korea at the time. But it is to just show that the experiences are a little more varied than we thought.
It really makes me wonder how different Korea would be to today if mixed Korean kids at that time were not forcibly sent away.
I know. And another thing I'll add is not just from the oral histories and memoirs, but I found the records of kind of this indigenous South Korean organization during the 1970s called Eclair, Eurasians Living as Indigenous Residents. And it was really this kind of government-sponsored, South Korean government-sponsored initiative to integrate mixed-race children into South Korean society. American humanitarians at the time disagreed with the integration effort. They thought that adoption was the better solution. So they kind of used their professional and material wealth to undermine and dismantle that indigenous integration program. What I learned in doing that research was this narrative that Koreans are, you know, too racist and backwards and static and insular and unchanging and unwavering in their kind of perception or view of mixed race Koreans. This narrative is really the narrative that we used back in the 1950s to justify these kind of problematic practices.
Yes.
So why hasn't our narrative like kind of changed or shifted or evolved? Why are we still kind of uncritically reappropriating those narratives, as opposed to considering the ways that Korean society maybe has evolved and changed, and the ways people's values have shifted, or views towards mixed race people have shifted, or difference have shifted as well.
The U.S. as
Okay, so before we continue, I kind of like thought about these things, you know, because I live here in South Korea. You know, what if, you know, they would have grown up with these kids here in Korea over, you know, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, then being a fully homogenous country. So it just made me kind of think about that. So, I mean, just food for thought. But let's continue on here.
is a country that had taken in so many Korean adoptees, and there is a big generation of Korean adoptees who have grown up in the U.S. that began after the Korean War, specifically with mixed Korean kids.
I think so. I would definitely argue that, because the number of mixed race children placed into U.S. homes in the late 1950s, early 1960s, only a few thousand really. But soon, those children needed to be replaced by children of full Korean parentage.
There just weren't enough mixed Korean kids.
Exactly. But Americans still wanted to participate because of their humanitarian and religious kind of impulses to do good in the world, or to do good for the U.S. It really expanded later on to children of full Korean parentage, and it wouldn't have been possible without the infrastructure laid out by mixed race Koreans, and the kind of even like scripts that were established about adoption as kind of this important solution to issues facing the Korean Peninsula.
Here you say claims of Korea being a backwards traditional culture helped to not only explain racism towards mixed race individuals, but also to frame the problem of prostitution and illegitimate children as an issue of South Koreans' Confucius culture and societal structure that made it difficult for women to get jobs, but easy for them to become prostitutes, rather than a problem of the US empire. The reason I think the ordinary American at that time would be okay with the idea of taking children away from their mothers is because, again, of the stereotype that those Korean women were simply prostitutes.
Yeah, they didn't love their own children.
They couldn't take care of them. They didn't love them.
I think like the children were used to obscure like US imperial practices in Korea at the time. They were used as kind of exemplars of American exceptionalist ideology. So they were being used to promote this image of the US, right? In rescuing them, the US was multicultural, racially liberal.
Right. Therefore worthy of being a world leader.
Not an empire. When you actually look at what was happening on the ground, right? Like the condoning of military prostitution, the separation of Korean children from their mothers and their families, the undermining of local integrationist movements, local efforts to integrate mixed race Koreans. All of these things actually do signal like the US kind of has this imperial power that they're using to exercise control over Korean people. But
and of course that, that's again, it leads to not just the United States, but as I said, since the United States is the police nation, it even brought in, more countries to say, hey, let's go, let's do this. Let's be humanitarian and adopt the kids.
If you fashion it up in kind of this humanitarian rescue narrative instead, you obscure those imperial behaviors and practices, and are instead able to create a very different picture of the United States and its actions in the world.
The Korean War, as we learn in the US, is also the forgotten war.
Yeah.
We study World War II to such depth and degree that the Korean War, I think, is very much glossed over. And I wouldn't be surprised is it because of issues like this.
Yeah, I think another part of that as well is the Korean War is difficult to commemorate because it was neither lost nor won. It ended in stalemate, in kind of an ambivalent ending. So how do you commemorate that or understand it? What is the social memory of a war that was neither won nor lost? And so the Korean War, in spite of, as you point out, actually being a Cold War conflict that was so important to the way that the US military and the US would operate in the Cold War era following that conflict, Korea is such an important origin site, I think, for understanding post-war US society and the Cold War. So yeah, other than it being kind of like an important like origin site for us personally, I think it also is an important origin site for just understanding the US and how it operated in the post-war era.
If you don't mind, I'd like to quote you wrote right after the fall of Pyongyang. Now that the Korean War is evidently drawing to an end.
Well, that's really a little silly now, doesn't it, considering what happened?
Okay, so, yep. So, yeah, so those certain just narratives that, we just learned from the guy. So, yeah, I'm just wondering, what all of this, where we're at today, because now, there's a huge now an adoption agency today of just a lot of, not just Americans, but a lot of, Koreans around the world. So I've actually met a few adoptees here and there, some that are even from France or, different Russia. So, there's a lot of mixed Koreans out there. So, but yeah, so this is the narrative that I was kind of wondering about this whole time. So yeah, and of course, yeah, I'm not an adoptee. I grew up with two parents, but this is kind of one of those subjects I just kind of like wonder about. So I finally found this video. This was video about maybe about a few years ago. So once again, shout out to the Happy Project for Becky and Cedric for putting that together. So yeah, so that's just one of the things I just kind of wanted to investigate and just kind of you know learn about. All right, so if any of you like any of this content, man, please hit the like, subscribe, and comment on what you think about this video. So wherever you are, everyone, stay safe, and I'll see you in my next video.